And welcome back to the Kiosk Presents. You know, there's probably been no bigger topic over the last 5 years than the financial crisis that really started happening in 2008. And, you know, a lot of people have kind of boiled it down, the media, to three things: the banks, Wall Street, and greed. And I'm one of those people thinking, well, that may be true, but you know what? When you peel back the onion a little bit, there's a lot more to it sometimes. We've got a special guest. His name is Dr. Jay Richards. He's the co-author of the New York Times bestseller Indivisible, and he's got a new book called Infiltrated. And we welcome you today, Dr. Richards.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Well, you know, I did have a chance to read your previous book, Indivisible, and I know in it you mentioned that the sort of the development of American finances over the last 100 years, you described it as an unraveling. And I know other people have written books called like The Unwinding of America. Why do you think that sort of terminology is what's being used to describe where America's gone in the last 100 years?
Well, you can just look at how the mortgage market changed. You know, if you looked 40 years ago at loans that Fannie Mae, this government-sponsored entity that buys loans from banks, the kind of loans that they would buy were prime loans, which meant 20% down payment. The borrower had to have a good job, clear, demonstrable ability to pay for the loan, and so forth. Well, by 2007, it was possible to get so-called ninja loans. That is, you could get a loan with no income, no job, or assets. Well, something radical must have happened that we ended up with all these risky loans in the system. And what happened was a set of so-called affordable housing policies imposed by about 25 different departments of the federal government, designed to encourage home ownership for lower income people, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, it led to these undesirable consequences, which is essentially the degrading of underwriting standards the banks would normally use when they're giving out a loan. And so there's no surprise that this kind of policy, as well-meaning as it was going to lead to a crisis.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I know in Florida and some other areas of the country that absolutely played itself out in the worst possible way.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to realize, you know, the price of housing was going up at several times the rate of inflation in many parts of the country. There wasn't any real obvious reason for this, but first of all, there's a lot of cheap money available to do it. Interest rates were low. And then banks were being encouraged to give out loans to people they would not otherwise give them out to, you know, in another age, and then sort of got let off the hook because they knew that they could turn around and sell them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so as a result, by 2008, the federal government had created massive demand for these risky loans, and so as it happens, 27 million of them were subprime or otherwise risky. That's half of all the loans in the system, and of those, 2/3 at the time of the crisis were either owned by government entities or entities operating under government control.
Oh, right. So, I mean, in one sense, it's sort of like, you know, so many Americans were sort of encouraged to drink the Kool-Aid, if maybe, I don't know if that's the best way to say it, and they did because they were given the promise of being able to do things. I mean, I kind of look at the same way with the American education system, you know, that you know, people were given this idea that you must have a college education for your kids and you must be able to finance it, and we're going to make this possible for you. And as you say, good intentions, but sometimes those good intentions have really come back to haunt everyone in a big way.
Absolutely. I mean, that's just basic economics. If the government subsidizes an activity, they're going to get more of it. Just as if, you know, the mayor of Seattle gave out $20,000 vouchers to all of the citizens of Seattle to go buy a new car, the price of cars in Seattle would go way up. And the same thing happens here. What you want is a mortgage system in which everyone has got a stake in the game. So the borrowers put in money for a down payment, so he doesn't want to default. The bank is going to suffer a consequence if the loan defaults, and they're not able to sort of fully get it off their books. And then there's not a demand from the federal government for these loans. All those things just completely scrambled normal market incentives that I think would have otherwise prevented the crisis.
Sure. Now, so all of this comes to a head in 2008, and in the wake of all that, now there's new talk of regulation, there's the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau, there's the DoddFrank Reform Act, all of these things coming in under the guise of being able to rein everything back in. And is that really what's happening?
No, I mean, this is the frustrating thing, is that we got this Reform Act in 2010. It was advertised as solving the problems that led to the financial crisis. Well, here's one sort of telling reality, is that it was called the DoddFrank Act, named after two members of Congress. Well, Dodd and Frank were probably the leading advocates in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s of affordable housing policies. And rather than being called to account for that, they actually got the reform bill named after them. And that by itself ought to tell people that, okay, maybe this bill isn't what it's being advertised as.
Well, and what about Elizabeth Warren? Because I know she's been sort of championed as someone who's really, going to be going after the system and everything else. But, is that really the case too?
Yeah, I mean, people won't realize that this idea of a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau actually came from her. This was her brainchild. It was speculated that she would be appointed as the first director of this new virtually unaccountable bureaucracy. She wasn't appointed because she had been on a committee that grilled Secretary of the Treasury Tim Geithner, and it turns out Geithner is the guy that was advising the president as to who he would appoint. And so somebody named Richard Cordray ended up the director of the CFPB. Elizabeth Warren ran for Senate from the state of Massachusetts, and now she's on the very powerful Senate Banking Committee. I don't criticize her for her intentions, but I talk about in the book about even her academic colleagues who have questioned her ability to, basic understanding of economics, and that's worrisome.
Sure. Well, so I mean, at the end of the day, for the common person, and obviously you've put so much time and research into what you've written, but it almost leaves many of us kind of feeling, well, golly, who can we trust here? Can we trust the people that are trying to fix it, or should we be putting our trust more back into Wall Street and the bank? Sometimes people don't feel like they can trust anybody.
That's right, and I mean, people do tend to be sort of confused and stultified because the whole system and the whole financial sector seems complicated and sort of unknowable to people outside of finance. That's why I wrote this book, though. I didn't write this for finance experts, but for just the ordinary reader and the ordinary American who wants to understand this. And so that's my goal, is that if you know nothing about finance or economics, you'll still basically get what caused the financial crisis and why we haven't fixed it. And then I end the book with some basic advice for what the average American can do to help prevent a future crisis.
Well, yeah, well, what can they do? Because, I mean, obviously, I know you talk a lot about free enterprise in the book, and, free enterprises has almost become a dirty word to some people, but my goodness, what's the alternative? And shouldn't we really be fighting for the best possible scenario of it, not where greed gets involved and some of the other things that can happen, or people taking advantage of it? But isn't that what, as Americans, we should all be striving for? And how can we battle the war against free enterprise?
Well, I mean, this is the problem, is that we recognize the attacks on free enterprise in the 20th century, whether it's Nazism or communism or socialism. That's not what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with the kind of cronyism that I refer to as a creeping soft tyranny, in which there's still a private sector, there's still private banks, but they're so thoroughly controlled and regulated by the federal government that they end up being kind of one big system. The benefit for this, if you're a politician, is that you can control the market, but then when something happens in the market and some crisis ensues, you can actually blame the private sector rather than yourself. It's this kind of cronyism of sort of very large businesses and government regulators working together that I think it's the kind of chief obstacle and chief enemy of free enterprise in the 21st century.
Sure, absolutely. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the book, once again, I'm holding it up, is called Infiltrated. The author's Dr. Jay Richards. And Dr. Richards, we really appreciate you being with us today. And ladies and gentlemen, what can I say? You should educate yourself as much as you can, read as deeply as you can, be open to all the different presentations and research that people have done, so you can really get a good handle on making decisions about how you're going to vote and what you're going to do to be able to help our children in the future. So Dr. Richards, thanks again for joining us on the Kiosk Presents.
My pleasure.